been invaded more than 19 times by Americans. Next slide. I'm going to go back. A lot of information there. Let's look at an enslaved person named Howard. He was awarded this, how should I put it, beating as a result of his attempts to run away as an escaped slave. You need to know that Howard joined the Union Army and fought in the Civil War. Next slide. This is a slide capturing and indicating how the indigenous peoples in this country were treated when Europeans and Africans first arrived, and I can't get into any great detail there. But again, notice, particularly on the extreme right, the pictures of Indian children who were taken away from their families to Europeanize them, to make them into civilized human beings. And in the middle and on the left, pictures of their graves of the children who died in these numerous Indian schools that you've all heard about that are placed all over the country. Next slide. And then finally, my last slide, but read this carefully. This is, again, a picture about the Statue of Liberty declaring in a manner consistent with the idea of democracy that somehow this country is, in fact, that kind of land. You all know the phrase, bring me your hot masses. Well, these are the hot masses. These are the Japanese Americans who were incarcerated. These are Mexican Americans at the border today. On the far right, on the bottom, these are Haitian immigrants today to try to come to this country. And then the other side represents Japanese Americans. So I present that to show you, again, philosophically, we violated this notion of e pluribus unum, and that we never practiced democracy. Thank you. You can go ahead. So what we actually practice in this country is really quite the opposite. And again, we cloak what we say in these awe-inspiring words, you know, make America great again. That America is this exceptional country. And of course, none of that is true. What is exceptional about America compared to any other of the great nations? I should just say nations. I'm not going to pronounce them great in the world and in this country. We have the most racially intense culture in the world. The only country that comes close to what we did was South Africa. And the legacy of that experiment in enslavement is still what drives American culture today. Listen to your politicians. Listen to your last former president, how he describes African nations. So what we practice is what the breed that drove the so-called founders of this country wanted to do and make for themselves. They were not interested in democracy as an idea that would care and meet the aspirations of most people, but how they would empower them. And we can gain further insight into this by looking at the American Constitution. I know over the years as I've talked on this subject, some professors have always thrown me out of various gatherings. But you tell me when I tell you a lot. The Constitution only allowed white males to vote. Only group of people who could vote. The Constitution declared persons of African descent 3/5 of a human being. The Constitution was really screwed in this notion of the Electoral College, where it says that you, the people who have early on made up only of white men, you really aren't smart enough and competent to select a leader. So we'll let you vote, but then this group of distinguished, well-endowed, talented, capable white men in the Electoral College will really decide your president for you. And the last president that we had, not the current, considered the worst in the world, remember, he became president as a consequence of the Electoral College vote. He did not win the majority vote. When we talk about this notion of we the people, I have an article that I'm going to put on the website here at the church at some point, and maybe at some point you'll get a chance to read it. It's called "You Want a Confederate Monument? My Body is a Confederate Monument." And it's about the writer in residence at Vanderbilt University, Carolyn Williams, of course, you didn't know about her. But what she means when she says that her body is a Confederate monument is that she is the daughter of, she's the great granddaughter of Edmund Pettus. You know who Edmund Pettus is? You know the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, that was made famous by Martin Luther King's march across that bridge. So that's one thing. A second article I want to talk to you about very briefly, again, is an article by James Baldwin. I hope all of you know who James Baldwin is and you have read a little bit about it, but he calls the article on being white and other lies. And what he argues is that there are no white people in America, that white people didn't come to America. The people who came to America were, again, Greeks and Romans and Frenchmen and Englishmen. But this idea of whiteness, you see, that has strangled any hope for democracy came into being through the experience of colonization. And it was a way of justifying and rationalizing what was being done and to rationalize the subjugation of peoples of color wherever they were found in the world. And then a final notion, and this man is from my home state of South Carolina, James Henry Hammond. I don't know how many of you know about him, but he's famous for this so-called mudsill speech, where he says that every group of people in the world need another group of menial workers to do the hard labor, and that this menial group of workers represented the very mudsill of society. And you know, mudsill in construction is the lowest foundation in a building next to the earth. So that's what he thought about the United States, and a highly decorated citizen of America. And I'm going fast, I'm going to stop in about 5 minutes. The other thing that gets us into trouble is this: we are truthful with ourselves about the reality of American culture and American society. We lie, and when I say we, I mean broad Americans broadly. We lie to other people and we lie to ourselves about that. We valorize some of the worst politicians and figures in the world and hold them up to be, again, you know, as our models, and that we should admire them. And I'm talking like people like Robert E. Lee. You know, my son currently teaches at Washington and Lee University, so it's funny. I tease him about that all the time. But remember, Robert E. Lee has monuments to him all over the country. Here is what I, with a consciousness growing out of this status of African American, have to say about Robert E. Lee. First of all, he was a traitor to the country. And in the Civil War, he literally ordered thousands of men to their death. Tell me when I'm lying to you. And then let's start with Thomas Jefferson, a so-called founding father. I tell people that he is still the country's most widely admired slaveholding philosopher of freedom. You tell me when I tell you an untruth. So when we grow up, children from the early stages of consciousness exposed to that kind of propaganda and philosophy, what are they to think? All right. So the reason we have done so poorly constructing and working at building a true democracy is that it is presented as it's a cave to allow the continued prosperity and domination of the economic ruling class in this country. It was never intended as something that the great majority of people in the country would enjoy. 2 more minutes and I'll be quiet and I'll stop. Now, back to this notion of—
Will you be open for questions?
Yes, okay, thank you. Back to this notion of what are the solutions that was asked for in the flyer. Actually, if there's ever any movement that we can point to that work to bring about true democracy in the United States, I can argue with some degree of evidence that these movements were led by African Americans, the formerly enslaved persons in this country. Not only that, but these movements were largely non-violent in nature. Let me give you some of them. The Underground Railroad movement, a peaceful movement to the extent that African Americans were allowed to continue to, again, carry it out as they found it, but of course it became violent in many ways. That's one. The second movement towards democratization was the Reconstruction era movement. I don't know how familiar you are with that, but it's the 10 years after the Civil War, where federal troops were kept on guard in the United States, and African Americans were actually elected to the Congress and to the state legislature in many countries, and authored the state college bill. I don't know if you know that. That came from African American legislators that made public education widely available. The third democratic movement was the civil rights movement. I'm assuming that some of you are familiar enough with that because I don't have to say much about that. A non-violent movement. And today, the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, there are a lot of movements aimed at bringing to being this notion of democracy, but they were all fashioned on these movements spearheaded by an unlettered, enslaved, marginalized, and oppressed group of people we call African Americans. And then one other group that's important in the way of fostering and bringing about democracy, since it's so closely tied to economics, is the creation of economic cooperatives. It's very powerful. There are several in Cincinnati. I don't know if you know about them, but what they do is that they're movements and organizations found by working class people and their mentors and people helping them to create self-owned, income-producing kinds of operations where they share the wealth and again, administer and manage these corporations by themselves. There's so much more I intend to say, and I've already talked more than 20 minutes, so I want to listen to David, but I hope I have made my point with you. Again, there is never going to be democracy in this country. It's up to us to bring it about. And then no change that's meaningful occurs unless there is a crisis. So we can lament what is happening right now. That is true, but it's an opportunity for us to take advantage of to make democracy a reality. Thank you for listening to me. I hope I didn't talk fast and I made some sense. Thank you.
You can go first, and then any questions? Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Peppers.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Thank you for your presentation. I think the order is good because it's the broader context, and I don't bring the academic chops you do to the conversation. But I think hopefully what I say fits in to what you've been talking about. And as you close, I hope, I think that people do perceive a crisis that they didn't perceive even 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. And the reason I wrote this book that I wrote that we talked about last year is because I think we see it more closely in Ohio than many states. I mean, I was literally at a protest yesterday in Columbus. Think about it. We are protesting this bill that would change the rules to let us have an election in August. It would change the Constitution of Ohio so that even a majority of Ohioans can't have their will expressed through their own laws. And the body that is doing that itself is sitting in unconstitutional districts because they violated the Ohio Constitution last year. To echo the point, that doesn't sound like a democracy to me right now. It's not. That also doesn't sound like the rule of law. But most Americans are walking around thinking, things are fine, we're a democracy. And so when I started writing this book, I didn't appreciate some of the history just shared, but I do now. And I've been doing in the parallels to this moment, to some of the worst moments in our history should scare all. And so the pattern in our history, I think, is, and I think maybe we can say that there's been a spectrum of democracy. We have never been perfect, but sometimes we were better than others. And I think Reconstruction is maybe the highest point, where we did have, for a few years, a diverse democracy in the South, protected by the federal government, where people don't realize a majority of many of those state houses were made up of Black representatives. And there were more registered Black voters in some states than white voters, and that was reflected in their state houses. And that was the high point. But on the flip side, there's a very clear pattern in America that whenever we get close to having the diverse majority reflected in government, there's a fierce backlash. And what should scare us all right now is the horrific backlash that, again, you know a lot more about than I do, in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, that was started on the myth of voter fraud, enforced by violence. The sort of white North stopped caring, and it destroyed that new democracy within years, and that what followed was Jim Crow for 30 years. And the similarities between then and now, you heard me say it, myths of voter fraud, which led to new rules and all sorts of suppression and things you all heard about, like poll taxes and grandfather clauses. And then, of course, enforced by violence with the KKK. All of a sudden, we have statues everywhere, reliving sort of what they call the Southern myths about the lost cause. I mean, we're seeing a lot of that play out right now. Same myths, same resurgence of violence, censorship of history, very similar. And so there's this pattern. Now we perceive there's a crisis at the moment, but it's part of the historic pattern of our country. And what's the cause of this pattern now? It's not Donald Trump. It came before Donald Trump. It was the same cause as the 1870s. A diverse majority got its way when it elected Barack Obama president. That was the beginning, and it wasn't just that Obama was president, although that was historic too. It was a diverse majority got its way in the way it voted for the Ohio State House. When Democrats actually won in 08. I don't mean to be partisan, but this is just sort of the trend. It was about the diverse majority as much as it was about one. And ever since then, just like going back to the late 1800s, there has been a systematic attack on that diverse majority, just like in the late 1800s. 2011, myths of voter fraud, voter ID, voter suppression, gerrymandering. Young voters were also part of that coalition. You got to deal with them through new voter ID laws. On and on and on. And so we are living in the same pattern of that spectrum, up and down, up and down. And I wrote the book sort of desperate to say, my book is called Laboratories of Autocracy, a wake-up call from behind the lines, meaning all America, you may be happy in a blue state somewhere, but this is happening everywhere. It's the same pattern. And it's the same attack on democracy, and states are being used in the same way that they were in the 1870s. Most of the damage is done through states in state houses. That's where they're doing the attack. And so the crisis is terrible, and there are real effects on real people right now happening. But if it does wake us up to both the history, but also it rips away this sense. You know, I worry, and we have slightly different views on some of this, although you're more of an expert than I am. I worry that we sit around and think, hey, it's America, like apple pie, mom, baseball, and democracy. It's just sort of here to stay. No matter what we do, we are in this intact democracy, and Russia may fall apart and Hungary may get Orban, but here in America, that just wouldn't happen. And I think that's problematic for a lot of reasons. It's not an accurate sort of summary of our history, but it also means we're not fighting for something that if you don't fight for it, it goes away. And I used to work for a guy named Nathaniel Jones, everyone here knows him, or John Lewis. They would have said to all of you, are you kidding me? You think democracy just is magically intact? What do you think we fought for through the 60s? We've been kind of living in this post-60s, post-Voting Rights Act, sort of privileged view that it's just here to stay. And the problem is that is not accurate. There is a side that is threatened by diverse democracy, and it's always fighting it, and it's taking different forms. And in the history of our country is, and it goes back to some of the movements that were mentioned, unless there is a side really fighting for democracy and to perfect it and to make sure it reflects the diversity of citizenship, you can lose it. And it's been lost many times in our country and in other countries. And my biggest fear at this moment is people don't really see it. And even if they do see it, I do think people are starting to wake up, but we aren't adjusting. And this gets more to the political point. A lot of the world basically has only conceived as fighting for democracy as, and this gets to the more nitty gritty of my book and another book I'm about to finish. Well, the way we fight democracy is we try to win a few more Senate seats and some House seats and re-elect Joe Biden. We did it. That's kind of where 99% of the effort, the money, the passion is. If we only do those things, then somehow that saves it. And the observation of my book is, if that was the main vehicle by which they were attacking democracy, that would be a correct answer. But when the way they're attacking democracy is through that crazy state house, passing unconstitutional laws, sitting in unconstitutional districts, gerrymandered to a hill so you can't get rid of them, suppressing everyone's vote, if all you do is focus on a few swing states in federal office, you're fighting the wrong battle. You're letting them have a battle. Well, I'll put it this way, as my 8-year-old son would understand, they're always on offense. Let's say a soccer field. They're always on offense where democracy is shaped and we're running around contesting a few swing states to win some senators. Who's going to win if they're always on offense and we're not even there? They are. So to give some more sort of, and I completely agree, if we do not confront what is happening and what they're doing and how they're doing it, and it's a pretty sobering thing to confront, but it better be confronted. If we don't, we won't solve it. But I hope once you see that we are in the same battle for democracy that's been our nation's history, we're not special. We're not in some zone where like it's all solved and we just get to win federal races every 2 years as if that's good enough. Once you see what I for most of my life didn't see, but now do, that no, we are in the same battle for democracy. The suffragists were in, the abolitionists were in, John Lewis was in. Once you see that that's the battle we're in today, it actually is very clarifying about what we are doing wrong and what we've got to do better. And what we've got to do better is see that democracy is, the front line of it is in every state. It has to be fought for in every state. People need to feel accountable for their politics in every district of every state. And that there's so much more that every single one of us can do to fight for it than we think we can do. And this goes back to those movements. You think that all they cared about was an election in 2 years, and then they walked away for a year and a half and took a break? And no, for the most part, elections were actually, frankly, since both parties weren't fighting for them, that was almost irrelevant to those fights. But now elections can matter, but so can using a church like this or city hall or library to engage and register every single suppressed voter that state house is suppressing, and that can be done every single day, all year, every year. There's a new voter ID law. Again, very targeted. Young voters, black voters, that's who's going to get left off of voting because of this new, completely unnecessary voter ID law. That's one of the strictest in the country. Don't go fight to re-engage voters with a few months ago an election with that voter ID law. Anyone who walks in this church should be actually explained to them, do you know about the new law? Do you have a license? Do you have a voter ID? Every kid who walks on the UC's campus, every 18-year-old in the CPS high school, right now, all these organizations should be figuring out we're in a battle for democracy, and we're going to use our entire footprint to lift democracy, which means lifting the voters that are being left out of a democracy intentionally by those in Columbus. And right now I'm working with Mike Borowski at CPS. Mika Owens is bringing forward a resolution at City Hall. So every library, every rec center, every health clinic engages people who walk through the doors that we know are being suppressed right now for the reasons we've talked about. So once you realize in your battle for democracy, my hope is, and I'll stop talking and go enough. It changes the way we think about the battle in key ways. One, as John Lewis would tell you, or my friend Stacey Abrams would tell you in Georgia, it's a long battle. It's not about the next election only. It's not just about elections. It's about what can you do every single day for years to bend the curve towards democracy, to a better democracy, even if imperfect. Number two, if you're only fighting for democracy in 7 swing states, you're doing something really wrong. because it's a 50-state issue. And that's how we can fight for it. And when we allow our federal swing state mindset to have us abandon 40 states, because they're not one that Joe Biden could win or one that he's going to win no matter what, we literally are allowing the anti-democracy extremism to go through a downward spiral because the extremists are the only ones in this conversation. And that's why you see states like Iowa and Indiana that Obama won, and Missouri that Clinton won, spiraling downward in extremism, even though not that long ago they were blue, and Ohio is going to do the same thing. Why? Because we are not seeing it as a battle for democracy. We are seeing it as a federal battle for certain office. And we're banning shit, we're giving them wins they don't deserve, and we're making them wholly unaccountable, even as they do extreme things. What's a great example of that? Kansas. When there was a battle last August about whether women should have the right to choose in Kansas, the women won because we actually engaged in a battle. You wouldn't have known it would happen normally because we're not even there making the argument. So all the time, long game, every state, every part of every state. The guy yesterday, when I was at that protest, the guy who's pushing the legislation to make us change the Constitution to get 60%, he didn't even have an opponent last November. What do you think these guys do when they do the most extreme things and then they get basically reappointed to office without even thinking about having to worry about election? They almost stop becoming public servants at all. They're doing the bidding of private folks and certain interests, using our public power and our public resources, yes, but they're not serving the public. They don't even worry about the public. They're walking back in no matter what. We've got to do this everywhere, not just in a few swing areas. As I said before, this is much bigger than Donald Trump. We make a big mistake, and your presentation could be more clear about that. When we think that Donald Trump is the reason democracy is struggling and not a lot deeper things in every state, we're letting a lot of people off the hook. We're voting for a lot of people who may not act like Donald Trump, but they're attacking democracy as fiercely as he does. Frank LaRose in Ohio being a perfect example. We've got to define the teams as, are you for improving our democracy and saving it, or are you not? If you're for it, welcome aboard. I don't care what party you're in, let's go save democracy. I don't care if you're polite, if you're not for it, you're on the wrong. And the fifth thing, like I said, is once you realize you're battle for democracy itself, my hope is that we all dig a little deeper and realize there's a lot more we can do than just giving a little bit of money to some Senate candidate, some swing state somewhere. That the battle for democracy, the front line is right here in Ohio, right here in Cincinnati, right here in those voters that we knock up the rolls that might go to the drop-in center, or the free store food bank, or wherever, and we can fight for those voters every single day. And there are ways that we all can do that we maybe never thought about. People ask me all the time when they hear my quite sobering, you and I walk around giving quite sobering presentations, and they ask me all the time, is it too late? I'm like, no, it's too late if we don't see it, if we don't respond to it with a different strategy, or if we quit, which is what they will do. But if we do those things, as you mentioned, those movements in the past overcame a lot more than what we have to overcome right now. They really did. So it's not too late. It's only too late if we don't see it, if we don't adjust, or if we just quit. And I'm not willing to do any of those, and hopefully you aren't either. Thank you all very much. I appreciate listening. Would love to open up the question.
Why don't we open it up? Maybe repeat the question because
Sure.
You had a question early on.
I did, but David answered them. Both talks were very, very illuminating, very powerful, and I think I agree with the 99% of them. We have no real good definition of democracy. We don't have democracy. We know we don't have it, but we don't have a good definition of what it would be. So, David, your call for more action on the side of being for democracy means that we've got to really talk about what does it mean. Does it mean something in the schools? Does it mean something in the hospitals? Does it mean something in the council, city council? So when you say we need to be involved on a 50-state effort that is nonviolent, what are we talking about here? What are the ways in which I, as an Ohio native or citizen of Ohio, can think about democracy in California or democracy in New York. My sense is unless we have a good definition of what democracy means and what we're fighting for, then the old definitions take over, which is the majority vote or the gerrymandered vote wins. That's the way the game is played. Corruption is one of the ingredients of democracy, and that it's always been that way. So it would be helpful if you both took a moment or two and said what you think democracy would look like in its best form. What are we fighting for?
Well, first of all, there's no such thing as a perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect solution to any problem. There are always going to be these rough edges. I think we've identified though the primary characteristics that would encompass, at least for me, democracy. In this phrase, government of, by, and for the people. Because that's the primary way it's being attacked now, by making it not of the people and by eliminating it in so many ways. So, you know, that's one thing we can do. For me, though, the key word for me that I'm not going to say is synonymous with democracy, but I'll put it up there, is equality. All right, and that's what I was getting at when I talked. Mentioned just very easily this book, Cooperative Democracy. We make our democracy competitive. You know what I mean? We're fighting each other about it, rather than simply cooperate. So those are two things.
Well, why isn't fighting democracy? Why isn't fighting the challenge of ideas democracy?
Democracy, but an element that is at the core of this culture also is that we compete to see who wins. We make it competitive. Like we have some schools that you really get in by testing to get into them. We have the high-powered elite universities. I hope people are not falling for that anymore. That's an illusion. You can get an excellent university education at the great majority of universities in this country. The internet makes that possible. And I would not trade my education at South Carolina State University, the only public university in the state of South Carolina, when it was segregated by law, by the education I would get anywhere else. And I've had to, on occasions, over the 35 years I spent in higher education, making this clear to people who told me I should submit simply because they went to Cornell, or they went to Harvard, you know, and I'm saying, you deal with me. You tell me why I should defer to what you are about and what you say. Because, you know, what I'm saying when I do this kind of presentation is I'm not so much into telling people what they should choose to do. What I'm doing is providing them with information that enables them to make the decision that they as a human being would want to make. And for me, that's treat others as you would want to be treated yourself. So that's what I'm getting at when I talk about cooperative democracy. And again, we aren't going to define the perfect model. We know that checks and balance doesn't work. We got a Supreme Court today with people like Clarence Thomas sitting there. And so now we are pitting the Supreme Court, one part of government against the Congress. And so, and I'll quit with this, but what we have been in for the last 20, 30, 40 years or so is a struggle about who will be in leadership in the country. And that is a struggle that has been conducted primarily, this is a rough number, I'm guessing now, between about 150 to 200,000 or so white men. And in defense of myself, let me say that I'm not bashing white men. They need to be liberated. I mean, if we could get the heads of some of these white men straight away now, we'd be fine. But I also believe in calling a spade, as we say in the Black vernacular. I hope that wasn't too long, and I hope something I said is helpful.
I'll just say, I mean, to me, when I'm talking about it, and I don't, I'm not a deep philosopher, but what I'm looking for at the bare minimum is that the governments of these states in the country generally reflect the majority will of the people. with obviously certain core rights that are protected, even if the majority don't want them protected. I mean, that's kind of the balance we've always sought. And the crisis, I think, in our country right now, and again, this is, I don't know if this is all too much to be saying in church, but I'm gonna just say it, like, what's happening right now is that people in power on one side sense that their worldview and their agenda is in the deep minority. And they know that in a world of a diverse democracy of equal voting opportunity and high turnout, that their worldview would lose over and over and over. And they are working to create a system where that doesn't happen. They don't, Ohio, that 60% amendment is the perfect symbol. They know that a constitutional amendment in Ohio giving women the right to choose would end like Kansas, probably 58%. They're fearful of that, so they need to change the rules so that the majority rule doesn't happen. And that is a perfect symbol of the entire movement, which is how can we lock into place a worldview that maybe has 35% support. On some issues, like guns, less. And the way to do that is to sort of rig enough of the rules at the state level that you can put into place 65 majority, where almost none of them face elections. They suppress the heck out of the vote of the other side, so they can keep passing laws that actually are deeply unpopular. If you look at polls, banning books is unpopular all over the country. It's a 70-30 issue against. But once you're locked into power, so I'm looking for the most basic sense that the results and the laws and policies that pass in these states in the country reflect the general view of the majority of people, knowing that in some areas there should be boundaries, of course, about core rights, even on popular groups, their expression and their way of life should be protected, even if they happen to be in the minority. And what we're having right now is a battle because some folks just don't want to accept that. And they don't want to accept the fact that their general view is simply something that is not mainstream today. You all know my dad, right? He's an old moderate Republican. This is when he gets a little bit like, David, are you really accusing people, a majority? Yeah. CPAC's in Hungary right now, studying a system that does what I just described. That's what Orban has done. Then they invited him to Texas to celebrate him again. Then they go, now Tucker would go and interview him there. They're not hiding this. And these days, if you're active online like I am, whenever I tweet the word democracy, I'll get a far right tweet back. Well, we're not a democracy. They're saying it a different way than you are. We're a republic. And somehow there's some far right-wing training out there that is convincing people that a republic means that somehow you get to gerrymander and suppress the majority, because that's what they say whenever I say, we're not a democracy, do your homework. I'm like, I did. Whatever history, I want to be one in a system that is basically saying we should be able to exclude the majority from every decision by systematically purging and gerrymandering is not a system we should be. So they're not hiding that they don't want a system of basic majority rules. And it's why? Because today's majority, like the 1870s Southern majority, is a diverse majority. And that sad, dark history of backlash, whenever there's a diverse majority rising, is playing out again very clearly. And that's, I think, we need to fight that, and we need to see it that way. And then when you say about schools in California, I'm not here to promote a new book, but a new book coming in May that's literally trying to answer your question. What can you do everywhere on the ground to take this on? Because I worry that we're starting to see more talk of the problem. But all I hear on TV is when they say, well, what do you do about it? They say, well, speak out. Speak out. We all need to speak out. It's so much more action. And it's action, whether it's stopping the school board from banning books because a few parents don't like the book. We can stop that. Most people don't want to ban books if we show up at the school board and make a lot of noise. It's signing up to be poll workers. They're trying to intimidate people from being poll workers. Don't get intimidated. Sign up, protect people's right to vote. There's all sorts of practical stuff. I'll stop and see Al says a question.
So you're saying to do things and this along this line. Do you think demonstrations do anything? I have mixed feelings about it, but what do you?
So I think the world of these state, yes, I do. These officials, they don't always, by the way, but they're better than, put it this way. Always think about this, what do they want? They want silence. They want everything they're doing to be seen as normal and okay. Let's not give them that. Let's do the opposite. So this demonstration yesterday about was great. These are folks, and this is a chapter in my book. They are used to sitting in a state house, and the reason state houses have become the perfect vehicle to that democracy is because no one knows, and no one knows what state houses do, and no one ever even calls them or goes to the meetings. And so they do it all there versus DC because they can do it, no one even pays attention. So yeah, you bet showing up and saying, we actually see what you're doing, we know what you're doing, we know it's being done here for a reason, and we're gonna be really loud about it. Actually makes a big difference, and there are bills, including a pass about a year ago, a lot of noise stopped one of these censorship bills that went through the state house, and it was trying to go to the state house. So I think all those demonstrations, showing up at school board meetings, and the opposite of what happens is the other side shows up demanding the books be taken away. That school board assumes that they must be the majority of the community, so they start taking the books away. So if you don't show up and they do, they win the narrative. If you show up as the majority and reflect that majority, you win the narrative. So I think showing up a lot more loudly through phone calls, emails, and in person, actually long-term is a huge part of it.
May I just quickly respond to that same question and say, demonstrate. Let me tell you this. The one essential part of the civil rights movement in the 50s and early 60s I was a part of was the demonstration. You get on TV, you shame those people who I would label, and I'm in a church, hypocrites, for doing the exact opposite of what they know would not be treatment they would accept themselves. In the early days of the civil rights movement, and I'm talking late 50s and 60s when I was an undergraduate, what we would do when we knew we were going out to demonstrate, we would call the news media. We wanted to make sure the news media was there. So we got the publicity, but what was the other reason? We knew that the beating we would get would be less. You see what I'm saying? Here's the other thing that demonstrations do. They motivate other people to action. They lead to the new organizations, new efforts about, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago, there were maybe 50 or so predominantly African-American led and originated organizations in this country. Today, there are 200, 250, and they're growing every day. And this is what the opponents of democracy recognize, that this old trope that African-Americans were less than intellectually and so on is a lie, but they continue to promote it. You know, you take this football game that everybody watches. Once the notion that African-Americans weren't smart enough to be the quarterback. Today, if you don't have an African-American quarterback, you are unlikely to win the Super Bowl. And you watch the first 3 people drafted in this recent football, they were all African-Americans, you see? And again, what the opponents of democracy sees and understand is that we are coming. And when I say we, I mean the gay and lesbian community, I mean the Native Americans, I mean Hispanic Americans, I mean African Americans. We are organizing. Watch TV. Look at the professionals in all of these highly technical fields that you see on the television shows today. The old South do not want to see that. Demonstrate, organize, protest, lead.
David, this is more information and gets to your thing about the states. When I chaired Common Cause 10 years ago, which is a state and national organization for political reform, one of the things that became very apparent to me, and it's become more and more apparent in your book, certainly shows that, is that the state government is the least known aspect of politics, that people know that very few of us can even identify who our state rep is. So when I would go out, I would occasionally testify before a House committee or a Senate committee in Columbus, they would be surprised. They would say, "What the hell are you doing here? You know, an average citizen coming here to talk about something." I mean, they're used to having a lot of lobbyists there and things like that. My question is, how do we fix I think we're in an information crisis too, where people are not accepting the same set of facts. And especially in terms of the state, we're often not getting any adequate information in terms of what's going on there.
One thing I would say, and again, in this book I'm writing, I try to be as practical as I can. If you have any kind of advocacy or civic group, I would add a state house component to it, where someone in that group, if I was a nonprofit, I would do the same thing. Like, this is the place that is impacting democracy, policy, life more directly in our state than Washington is on almost every issue. But most of our, sometimes more than local government, other times not. But almost none of our groups are watching that. So what I would do is, if you have a civic group, an activist group, whatever group, have a state house component, have someone in that group whose job it is to keep up, have them report to the group when there's a regular meeting. Invite a state rep, but there's phenomenal state reps up there doing a great job. They're outnumbered to the gerrymandering. Have them appear. I have a group I started through all this called Blue Ohio. I have a monthly call. And I get about 80 or 100 people on that call. And I talk almost all about the state house. And I'll have a guest from the state house or someone who's involved in the state house join us. People get a ton out of it. So I would just say every group should try and formally add to their what they do.
The league does that.
Yeah, exactly. The league will do that, but I would say like the Women's Global Caucus, Women's City Club, whatever it is. And once you start doing that, then you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that these 4 bills are going forward. Let's all make some noise. Let's get on a bus or make some phone calls. Because once you add it, you can't, and by the way, you can sign up for alerts about what bills come to committees, but they thrive because no one does it. And to get very political again, and the Koch brothers and Alec go to these state houses because they know nationally that's where to get the stuff done because no one does it anyway. And by the way, this is a long topic. When the local media is dying, no one covers it. These guys know that if they throw, and it's mostly guys, if they throw 30 bills forward, maybe the media has this capacity to cover 2. And the other 28 sail right on through. And no one even, they literally, he won. We had our Wisconsin, I'll say when I was a Democratic Party chair. We had our Wisconsin moment. We managed to win 3 out of 7 Supreme Court seats. And we had an independent Chief Justice. So we had our win in Columbus to finally, for the first time in decades, have an independent Supreme Court, just like Wisconsin. Months later, the State House, just like they did in North Carolina, because the same thing out there, they changed the rules of how we elect justices to stop that from happening. Think about that it's an attack on the rule of law if a body is changing the rules of how the body that oversees their laws is selected. And they did that, you would never even know. It didn't even get covered. And if we saw another country, if Viktor Orban or Israel, the same thing, they led to those protests. They're trying to change the judiciary. It happened in Columbus. It's not even a story. No, all of a sudden you show up and you see it differently on your ballot, but you have no idea that that ballot order and the party ID that's now attached to those judges was done to undo having an independent court. And so again, all this happens because it's a place that no one pays attention to, which makes it the perfect place to cause trouble. In our entire nation's history, frankly, 9 times out of 10, this is where the trouble has always come from. This is where it's been done.
It's succeeded.
Yes,
State legislature decided.
absolutely.
But I think that deflects us from the local area here. We've got serious local issues. Forget about the state office for a moment. We've got health discrepancies that have been permanent in our last 100 years, where black people die twice as often as white people.
Right.
We've got school situations where we have not observed Brown versus Board of Education since 54. We've had to litigate over and over again to get equality in the schools. Housing situations, we were talking recently to the people in home. There's still massive discrimination against black people in the community as well.
Right.
So the basic issues of income inequality, housing, food, education, and health, all of those are getting worse. They're not getting better. So the question is, yes, there is a commitment and concern about the State House. I totally agree with both of you on that. But in terms of how do we instruct people at the local level to say that school is important to you and your future and your neighborhood's future? That hospital that won't take in any black people is important to you and to your future. There is no civic education, David, that teaches us that we have the right or the ability to go and say to a hospital that's in Avondale, called Children's Hospital, that you need to worry about infant mortality across the street. We have no civic education that says we can talk to the CEO of Children's Hospital and we can say that we can no longer be number 3 in the nation with the Children's Hospital and number 3 in the nation in infant mortality. It's crazy.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
where
I
that
say this, I mean, we have to start seeing all these offices as frontline. I'm focused on the State House because I think that's the extreme problem. But you bet in a day and age where they're trying to suppress our own understanding of our own history. The school board is a frontline office when it comes to them. It's a frontline office. And this is one reason we also have to stop calling anything but so much of our problem is because we are so fixated on federal presidential that we call everything else an off year. And think about what that says to the average voter. If literally the politicos are saying it's an off year, then the person who rarely looks at the presidential is saying, well, it must not be important at all. Even though, as you're saying and we're saying, no, that midterm is actually where democracy of your state is shaped. That odd year is where you elect your city council and school board, which are frontline positions on this stuff. Here's another way we frame it. We always talk about, I know we have to run, I see Alice is not some sort of handsome. We also say that these positions are the bench for the future positions. Like, you think Bill Sykes thinks he's on some bench for a future? No, he's on the front line. He knows it. Alec knows it. The Koch brothers know it. But we act like you only really matter once you go from that bench to federal office. So much of our frame is warped by the federal stuff, and we have to start saying that the Forest Hill School Board election this November, when they're trying to suppress votes and treat certain students differently, is a frontline democracy office, and let's show up and elect the right people there. We just didn't frame it all. It's not a whole civics education course, but our most basic language is telling people that stuff doesn't matter as much.
If we could end up,
Yeah.
we could end up for this, and we can continue our discussion here among ourselves. So yes, but let's end up for the
Now, we would like to thank Prince Brown and David Tucker